The United States is engaged in a new Cold War against both Russia and China. The US and Europe are arming Ukraine and fighting a proxy war against Russia. And now the US is supporting separatism in Taiwan, sending weapons and troops, and trying to provoke a conflict with China. And at the same time, the US has imposed sanctions and export restrictions and tariffs on Russia and China. And this is all part of an attempt to try to maintain US economic dominance. But in reality, what it has done is it has continued to push China and Russia closer together, and they have become very important strategic partners. And we saw a clear example of this May when Russia's President Vladimir Putin traveled to China to meet with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. And this was the 43rd meeting between Presidents Xi and Putin. 43rd meeting, which shows just how close not only Xi and Putin have become, but how close China and Russia have become. Now, during Putin's trip, China and Russia signed a lengthy joint statement. It is 8,000 words long. I read through the statement and I highlighted some of the main points, and I want to discuss them today because this is a very important historic document that shows that China and Russia are collaborating in basically every domain. In the statement, they emphasized that China-Russia relations are at their best level in history. They emphasized that their goal is to build a multipolar world, that the world is already multipolar, but they're trying to make it even more multipolar with the goal of the democratization of international relations. In the same vein, they called for expanding the BRICS bloc and strengthening the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And Russia and China emphasized that they support the global South, that Asia, Latin America, and Africa must play an increasingly important role in the world. And in that same vein, China and Russia condemned what they referred to as neocolonialism and hegemonism, which was a clear reference to Western aggressive imperialist foreign policy trying to dominate the world and the West's constant attempt to start wars, to meddle in foreign countries' affairs, to exploit global South countries. Likewise, in the statement, China and Russia harshly condemned the US for militarizing really the entire world, militarizing East Asia and the Pacific region, militarizing West Asia, the so-called Middle East, militarizing Australia, trying to start a war over Taiwan, fueling the war in Ukraine. China and Russia were very critical of the US also for trying to militarize space. And China and Russia said that they opposed the militarization of space. And of course, Beijing and Moscow proposed many different forms of cooperation, most importantly, economic cooperation and de-dollarization. China and Russia emphasized that they want to reduce the use of the dollar not only in their own bilateral trade, but in international trade to weaken the hegemony of the US dollar, which is used as a geopolitical weapon. The US has weaponized its currency and tried to impose its political will on other countries through the use of its currency and the international financial system that is dominated by Washington. And China and Russia emphasized that the only solution is true multilateralism, true international democracy, and multipolarity, moving away from Western hegemony, the unipolar order in which the US tried to dominate the entire world, and instead giving an equal voice and equal representation to all countries, especially the countries in the global South, who represent the global majority, and yet were colonized by the Western imperial powers. And still today, the West maintains this very neo-colonial hegemonic mentality that tries to control them. These were all issues that were addressed in this 8,000 word statement published by China and Russia. I'm going to be looking at the statement in a moment. But first, I want to briefly review some points that were revealed in an article in the Financial Times, the major British newspaper, which is titled, China, Russia, an Economic Friendship That Could Rattle the World. Now, of course, the Financial Times is very biased against both China and Russia, and in many ways represents the interests of Western governments, and in particular, Western investors, Western capitalists. But the Financial Times does have some very useful information, especially useful data. And in this report, they note that Putin's visit this May was his 43rd meeting with President Xi, and they emphasized that economic links between the two sides are booming. The newspaper pointed out that bilateral trade between China and Russia reached $240 billion in 2023. That is up 26% against the year before, 2022. That is a massive increase in just 1 year. And I should add that while China and Russia have been trading more and more, they have basically completely de-dollarized their trade. This was reported in April by Russian state media. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reported that Russia and China have almost completely shirked the dollar when doing business, with more than 90% of mutual payments being done in national currencies, China's currency, the renminbi, and Russia's currency, the ruble. They have dropped the dollar, and now they're encouraging many other countries around the world to trade with their own local currencies and de-dollarize as well. And there's a very useful chart that shows that since 2021, EU exports to Russia have halved, and they decline more and more by the year, whereas since 2020, Chinese exports to Russia have more than doubled. So we can see a clear trend here. China and Russia are more and more deeply integrating, not only politically, but economically, whereas Europe is becoming more and more economically dependent on the United States. And it's not just Russia. In fact, China has been deepening its economic relations, in particular with countries that are trying to resist Western hegemony. The way the Financial Times puts it is that China now is the biggest trading partner of 120 countries, the majority of countries on Earth, including those antagonistic to the US-led West. That's the language the newspaper uses. Really, countries that are resisting US-led Western imperial hegemony. And there's another very interesting chart here that shows that China's trade has been increasing with many countries, including Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Belarus, Saudi Arabia, and even in Central Europe with Serbia and Hungary. And President Xi just took a trip to France, Serbia, and Hungary and deepened economic relations, in particular with Central Europe. Now, while the West has been trying to economically strangle Russia, US President Joe Biden said that his goal was to turn the Russian currency, the ruble, into rubble. Well, meanwhile, Russia has instead been trading more and more with China. And in 2023, Russia overtook Saudi Arabia to become China's biggest supplier of oil. So those were some concrete examples of how China and Russia have been deepening their economic relations. Now I want to analyze this 8,000-word joint statement that was signed by Presidents Xi and Putin when the Russian leader visited Beijing this May.